I'd like to follow up on what Ron Dart was sharing in this second part of wrestling with Jacob. And I especially was noticing what he was saying about two images of God. We have two conceptions of God that have come up that have caused a lot of the conflict and debate, and I think a march towards greater truth as we discuss these things, specifically the God of pure will versus the God whose essence is love or absolute good. And so when we talk about the God of pure will, we mean a God who can do whatever he wants and that makes it good. That is, a God who could choose absolute voluntarism, that is, act of his own accord in pure will, whether he would regard that as human evil or human good. When it's divine, it's absolutely good because God wills it. And so in the God of pure will, you could have incidents like genocide. If God wills it, that makes it good. And in fact, you can take it all the way from any form of redemptive violence into some of the atrocities that we see even in books like Lamentations and so on, where we have Babylon coming, surrounding Jerusalem, people starving to death, and women having to eat their own babies because they're dying. And so this is considered good if it's God's will. By contrast, you have a God of the ancients, the early church, who would say that God is love in his very essence. In fact, Archbishop Lazar would go as far as to say God is only love, and everything else is a reflection of that love. If you think of love as a diamond, there aren't other diamonds in his attributes. God is love, and there are other facets, but all of these must reflect the perfect love of God. Another way we could say this is that God is the perfection of all we call goodness. And so we would think about the good, or love itself, and then how that's expressed as beauty, truth, justice, and compassion. Of course, Jesus Christ comes along and he shows us that this latter is his vision of the nature of God, love and compassion, not only giving us a revelation of it through words and teachings and deeds, but in his own nature. And of course, we see this to the nth degree on the cross. On the cross, we have God showing himself to be cruciform, that is cross-shaped, that is consenting and self-giving, radically forgiving, co-suffering love, to be crucified in order to enter death and overcome death permanently. And so we not only get this revelation of who God is, but we get an act of victory over Satan, sin, and death. It's this kind of good God, this kind of essential love God that we see in Jesus Christ. Now, where this becomes a practical issue is that when you serve a God who's pure and absolute will, you tend to become his agents, and we become like the God we worship. And so then freedom becomes our highest moral value. My freedom to do what I want, how I want, when I want, with whom I want. And if you secularize that, you have modern liberalism. On the other hand, you can have a God who is love, and then that expresses itself in the Christian ethic. A Christ-like God leads to a Christ-like people with a Christ-like ethic. And this is no mystery. We're not picking and choosing according to our own whims and desires, or even according to the cultural left or right in the culture wars. Rather, we see the true God, whose perfect love, expressed in Jesus, sharing exactly what that love ethic will look like. And we see it in the Beatitudes specifically and overtly, and then it's unpacked for us throughout the whole Sermon on the Mount. It's theologized for us in Philippians chapter 2, where we see a God who empties himself to become a servant in order to overcome the human condition and bring us into salvation. And we also get commentary on this throughout the whole book of James. And so we see that a God who is pure will sort of engenders a kind of ethic of pure freedom. And that pure freedom is not so free if you consider that really it's a slavery impulse to our own demands and desires. On the other hand, if we have this God who is absolute love and the perfection of all we call goodness. We're going to have an ethic that mirrors that. And that's really what I'm promoting in our book, A More Christ-Like God, A More Beautiful Gospel. That the God we serve is not a deadbeat dad or absentee landlord, nor is he a tyrant king or a punitive judge, nor is he a sugar daddy in the sky or a genie in a lantern to be manipulated for our own will. Rather, the image of the invisible God is Jesus Christ himself. And I'm going to leave it now for section 3 or part 3 of this series to Archbishop Lazar, who's going to share with us a little bit about how some of these issues really weren't issues in the ancient church, and they became a problem much later on.